Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on Om Times flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. We've all wondered at some point, who am I? Where do I come from? And why am I here? Today, we're going to examine those existential questions through a vastly different lens with researcher, speaker, and internationally best-selling author Paul Anthony Wallis, whose books, interviews, and documentaries are read and watched by people worldwide. A senior churchman who's a church doctor, a theological educator, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia, Paul Anthony Wallis has published numerous titles on Christian mysticism and spirituality, three of which in particular, collectively known as his Eden trilogy, are expanding the dialogue to include the arguably more pressing questions: who created you? Who or what is God? And what have the world's governments, churches, and militaries been keeping from us about our origins as a species and our true potential? Anthony Wallis, welcome.
Sandie, g'day. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Good to have you here, Paul. Your books are absolutely riveting. And these three titles, Escaping from Eden, which was hailed by George Newry as this generation's Chariot of the Gods, its internationally best-selling sequel, The Scars of Eden, which is endorsed by Eric von Daniken, and your latest book, Echoes of Eden, which is due to be released in 2 weeks, offer some truly explosive revelations about ancient stories from around the world and in the Old Testament, which describe entities that we would identify not as God, but as ETs. So let's talk a little bit about where all of this started for you, because with the background that you had in ministry, to move into something like this is truly, I would think, quite unusual, if not totally rare, and groundbreaking, and also very courageous.
Certainly, it often surprises people the route I've taken to get into the world of paleo contact, but the journey really did begin in the world of ministry, because part of my work was training pastors in hermeneutics. That's the principles of interpreting ancient texts. And so we would do form analysis, where you ask of every text, what kind of literature is this, and how do we work it out? What are the clues in the text? And then source analysis asks, what was the original version of this story, and how does this version differ? Because the difference tells you what the author's trying to get at. And they would always ask the essential question, what do the words mean? And it was actually applying those basic tools to the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, that opened up the doorway to the world of paleo contact. Certain key words where there are some translation questions and anomalies around those translation moments that clue you that there may be another story going on in the text that we've missed. And so there came a time a few years ago when I had the time to drill down into those questions. In Escaping from Eden, I talk about an injury from a game of ultimate frisbee, and it's in the convalescence time that I do all the study. It's actually a bit of a metaphor for a number of times when the universe has gifted me with the opportunity for deeper study. And it was that work in Bible translation that opened up the whole world of ancient ET contact. A little to my surprise, I'd always suspected there might be an ET or two wandering around in the text. But what I found when I did the translation work absolutely blew me away. It changed my world in a way that I knew I had to share the journey with others to open this world up for others.
It must have really shaken your faith.
There were a couple of moments where the floor seemed to fall away from me, I must say, but there was a kind of a gradual evolution for me as well, because I'd long known that what Jesus talks about when he talks about the kingdom of God is something far, far bigger than just Christianity, and that our concept of God is very limited when you begin to piece together what God means if God is the source of the cosmos and everything in it. So there's plenty in the Bible and in the teaching of Jesus that had been shifting me, expanding my thinking. And then there was another element as well, and that was at the age of 11, I read Erich von Däniken. And the questions that he asked in his book, Chariots of the Gods, had just sat with me for decades, because I felt he'd really put his finger on a gap in our ability to explain ourselves as an intelligent, conscious species. And the answers I was getting as an 11-year-old at school were not satisfying me. The religious answer that we're God's special creation failed to explain why it's so obvious we're some kind of animal. Wouldn't we be more different with some kind of primate, aren't we? And then the scientific answer to explain why we're the alpha species on the planet, well, the answer is it's because of our higher intelligence, our higher consciousness, the ability to build a fire, make a weapon, that put us at the top. Ask the question, where did that come from? The consciousness and intelligence, and there's a gap in our ability to explain.
Yeah.
So at the age of 11, I thought, well, Erich von Däniken has correctly identified the gap. He's suggesting that external interventions in our development as a species might make more sense of our story. And to my astonishment, when I started doing the Bible translation work decades later, it was stories of external interventions that began to emerge in the ancient texts.
Well, didn't Plato, 2.5 millennia ago, say the same thing? That there was definitely some kind of, what's the word? Not interference, but something that was happening with us, and that there were possibly other beings that were in charge of that.
He most certainly did. He talked about interventions in our development as a species, specifically to upgrade us for higher consciousness and higher intelligence. He talked about other entities that had been involved in forming our part of the cosmos and terraforming our planet. He talked about cosmic neighbors who are very similar to us, but more advanced, had more advanced tech, had craft that looked like islands in the sky. They lived longer. They had a more developed understanding of space. You're absolutely right, Sandie. All that was there in black and white in the works of Plato 2,500 years ago. And every person who studies theology to become a minister, as I did, to become a priest, has to read Plato, except like a lot of trainee priests, we read handouts on Plato. And we didn't read the whole book. And if we had, we would have found that much of his information was rooted in contact experiences, and his point of view was paleo contact. And it was only when I did the research for Escaping from Eden that I remembered that many of the early church fathers, really significant leaders at the beginning of Christianity, viewed the Bible through the lens of Plato. They found in the Hebrew scriptures accounts of interventions in our evolution as a species, everything that Plato had talked about. They found no disagreement. And in fact, there was a big tussle and a big debate as to what to do with the Hebrew scriptures at the beginning of Christianity. And many significant church fathers said, well, we can't just glue the scriptures on to the teaching of Jesus, because the way they're translated at the moment obscures everything you and I have just talked about, Sandie. And they felt that it was important to remain a part of the public conversation. Unfortunately, those church fathers lost the debate. And so the wider picture of our place in the cosmos and our wider cosmic family got excluded from mainstream Christianity. And as that joined with the powers of the empire, these wider stories were suppressed and turned into heresy and made a taboo, so that even to this day, I think I scare a lot of people in the world of faith, because I am speaking something that's been forbidden for nearly 2,000 years.
Yeah. And as one of their own, that's even worse.
I know, even worse, a senior churchman. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been thrown out, have you? Or did you do a
No,
graceful exit?
I haven't. I was very fortunate that I was between congregations when I started doing the research for the Eden series. And I think if I was leading a congregation, I couldn't have put these books out because it would have split my congregation. I think in almost any congregation, if you start talking about ET contact or a populated universe or paleo contact, about half your congregation will say, "Oh, thank you so much for breaking the taboo, because I've seen this in the Bible as well, or because I had this close encounter, or because my ancestral knowledge has told me this. Thank you so much, because we can now talk about it." And then the other half would say, "This is heresy, Pastor. You can't stay here." And you would split your congregation.
Yeah.
So I was very, very fortunate that I didn't have those obligations. All the same, I knew I was taking my life in my hands by publishing on this topic. And let's say that there are some friendships that have gone a little bit quieter after they've seen what I'm writing, but I have gained thousands, I could say millions of new friends who are saying, yes, I recognize this. And it's a huge relief, because opening up this old interpretation of the ancient texts removes distortions in our images of God and our images of ourselves, distortions that are really very demeaning and limiting and have been ruinous to our understanding of God and how we've lived in the world through 2000 years. So this is part of my sense of urgency in doing this, because if you can realize that God is the source of the cosmos and everything in it, and not something violent, dangerous, punitive, unpredictable you have to tiptoe around, well, the psychological relief is indescribable.
Yeah, well, there has been quite a bit of controversy recently. I've read several reports, several books, etc., that talk about there being two gods in the Bible. You know, there's Yahweh, the punitive, angry, obey me God, and then there's, you know, Jesus's Father, who is all loving and encompassing. And I think that's probably primed a lot of people. But the other thing that's happened recently is that NASA announced that they had recruited a number of people from different religions to help them work out how their congregations, their flocks, would respond to the news of ETs. And if NASA are doing that, then somebody somewhere is getting ready for some serious disclosure.
Yes, there has been a lot of getting ready that we've seen over the last decade or so. And technically NASA didn't hire the theologians, but it's been working with theologians. And half the equation is, how will people in the churches respond? And the other half is, how does NASA communicate information that might have theological implications? So absolutely, that is being ready for some kind of communication. And then, of course, we've had the Senate briefings, which was a rather interesting moment. This was when a lot of people were hoping and expecting that the Senate Intelligence Committee would be told everything the Pentagon knows about UFOs. Well, in 9 pages, I don't think we got everything the Pentagon knows, but we did get some very interesting information in that briefing. And that was that if you just look at UFO encounters or UAP encounters experienced by US defense and reported through defense channels, if that's all you look at, so you're not looking at civilian encounters, you're not looking at global encounters, just US defense and those reported, every 6 weeks, US defense activity is interfered with by UFO encounters. That was the information, and it's been at that rate for the last 17 years, because they only looked at 17 years. Well, that's quite a lot of encounters. And then the report went on to say there is zero evidence this is the covert technology of any power on Earth. So that was in that little flimsy 9-page report. Just enough information to prime us in case more comes out is how I read that. It's sort of an insurance against disclosure. And it echoes the work of the Vatican from 2009, when Pope Benedict XVI, he's the most conservative pope in my lifetime, blew my socks off when he called upon the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to convene a symposium, they call it a colloquium, gathering top scholars and theologians to discuss, and here it is, the theological implications of contact with other civilizations. And as part of that exercise, there were leading spokespeople for the Curia who met the press, did TV interviews, and they said, we should be ready for contact, and we shouldn't be surprised to encounter extraterrestrials because they're in the Bible. They're in the Old Testament, they're in the New Testament, and we should recognize them as part of God's creation. This is our wider cosmic family. These are brother and sister aliens. And there's no theological issue. And I thought, oh my goodness, only 400 years ago, we were burning people at the stake for merely suggesting there might be intelligent life on other planets. Now, all of a sudden, we should be ready for contact, and it's in the Bible. And I thought, okay, I think this is a measure ensuring them against disclosure coming from another source that they can't control. And then if that happens, they can say, don't you remember we already discussed this? There's no issue here.
Yeah. Because what they don't want is people saying, well, that's not Mother Mary, and that certainly isn't Jesus Christ. It's an ET.
But there's certainly been a shift. There is something in the air that's different now to times past, because in recent years, we've had very authoritative figures stepping forward and saying, yes, we're in contact. So we've had Alain Juillet, the former chief of French intelligence, acknowledging the work of ATIP in the States, which he says is examining metamaterials from UFO crashes. Luis Elizondo, who headed that unit for the Pentagon, has come out and said this was his work for 10 years. The Pentagon has authenticated the film footage of the Tic Tac encounters of 2004. And then we had the briefing paper. We had, about a decade ago, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev on camera acknowledging that we are already in contact with a multitude of spacefaring civilizations. And you can watch that on YouTube for yourself. You work out if you think he's joking. He doesn't look like he's joking. He wasn't debunked by the president. And then 2 Christmases ago, Hayem Eshed, Israel's former chief of space security, the brigadier general who held that position for 27 years, said that on the basis of his experience, his understanding was that we are already in contact with an intergalactic federation, which has chosen not to self-disclose until you and I have a better understanding of space. Now, this should have blown people away when Hayem Eshed said that, but he was in fact only repeating what our ancestors have told us in ancestral narratives, world mythology, for thousands of years. And that's where I've gone. I've gone on a world tour, sitting at the feet of elders of traditional cultures and realizing that this explanation of our origins as a species has always been there. It's never gone away. It's simply been pushed down to the grassroots, never quite making its way into a school textbook or the official narrative. But if we listen to our ancestors, we have always known these things.
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, for years we've known the Dogon tribe, have talked about where they came from. I mean, there's been so many different cultures that have what people call a mythology, but in fact, you know, who can say whether it's a mythology? Your books, I mean, they cover so many things, you know. There's 3 of them. The third one is coming out in just 2 weeks, and very timely they are too, with all of this speculation and going on. But evidence of secret ceremonies in Southern Africa, strange phenomena in Australia and Iraq, mysterious encounters. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, and it's every single culture. So how can people not take it seriously?
I agree with you, Sandie. For me, it really was the correlation of stories all around the world, from culture to culture, cultures that in the deep past had no contact with each other, sharing stories which there are often clues that what we're getting is a visual memory that's been curated by a particular story. And if you listen to the Edo narrative from out of southern Nigeria and Benin, or you listen to the Filipino narrative, or the Mesoamerican, or the Hebrew, or the ancient Sumerian, there are certain details that repeat that are very, very visual. And so they talk about how the planet appeared when our powerful visitors arrived from the sky. And they will say it was flooded and shrouded in darkness. And then something came and hovered over the floodwaters. So the Filipino story said there was this giant hawk hovering over the waters. Well, was it a hawk, or did it only look like a hawk? If you go to the Hebrew, it says it was a thing creating a strong blast of wind that hovered like a hawk. Merahephet is the Hebrew word. So it was like a hawk, and it hovered, and it created vortices of wind, which then cleared the waters. And the memory of the clearing of the waters is there in all those stories. What was it? Well, you read the Mayan story, and it says there were entities in that thing that was hovering, and they were discussing how to rehabilitate a devastated planet post-cataclysm. So these stories all finesse each other. And another visual memory is something coming down from the sky, and then there's a being who's come down from the sky, and then the being is doing powerful technological things. So the Edo say he came down on a chain from out of the sky. You read the Hebrew story, and the powerful ones come down on a ladder that comes from out of the sky. And so you can see that they're using the technology of their own world, their own culture, as a way of describing what they saw. And the more of these visual echoes that I found recurring in narratives all around the world, the more I realized what we're looking at is ancient memory that's been curated by these stories. So it's not that we have to read these stories in a fundamentalist way, you know, every detail, minute by minute, word by word, that's exactly what happened. This is how our ancestors have carried the memory. And it was the correlations that made me go back to these stories and ask different questions. What is the memory that our ancestors have carried? What is it they wanted us to know about these ancient events?
And what is it? Why are other species interested in reviving a planet that is all but dead?
Well, there might be many answers to that. I think if we accept that we're part of a cosmic family, then it's very possible that others arrived here for the same reasons that we go into other countries after a natural disaster. If there's massive flooding in Haiti, in Bangladesh, we go in, and the first thing we do is we separate the waters so that they've got fresh, safe drinking water, and then we rehabilitate the land so it's safe to live on, supplies, so on and so forth, dealing with all the pollution that's resulted from the flood. Well, that's the same, really, as what we read in Genesis 1 when we translate it the way I argue for it in Escaping from Eden. So there could be purely compassionate reasons. Our cosmic family is reaching out to assist. And I find it really exciting and positive that the first stories of paleo contact told by many cultures are stories of assistance. It's not all, you know, Independence Day, Mars attacks, invasion of the body snatchers. This is a benevolent action. And then many of our ancient peoples, as we mentioned just before, you listen to stories from Native American peoples, Aboriginal Australian peoples, the Dogon of Mali and West Africa, they speak about their cultures beginning with visitors from Sirius or the Pleiades sitting down with their elders and teaching them how to live in a non-subsistence way on the planet and build a civilization. again, it's benevolent. There are other stories as well in the mix. So you get to the stories of abduction and hybridization. These are not stories that were invented by the National Enquirer. Our ancestors have been telling these stories for thousands of years. And there's something else is going on, because it appears that some of our neighbors want to enrich their own gene pool with some of what we have as Homo sapiens. We seem to be very, very attractive to some of our neighbors, and they're wanting to either strengthen a gene pool that has become too limited, or they want some of what they see in us. I have come to believe that human beings have a unique blend from our earthling heritage and the ET aspect of us as well, from the time when we were being adjusted and fine-tuned and engineered. But it's created a species with a unique capacity, I think, for love, compassion, creativity. And I think our experience of life is more colorful than some of our neighbors have. And I think they want some of what we've got.
Well, I'd really like to know what is it about us that they want. But there have also been many, many stories about how way back, the stories of Enki and Enlil and Zechariah Sitchin's work, that we were, an inferior kind of race that was then upgraded in order to be useful to our masters, whether it was mining for gold or whatever, the stories tell. So if that was true, and if now they're looking for something in us that they want, then, that's a bit of a switch around, isn't it? Because before they just wanted to upgrade us to suit a certain purpose. Now it might appear that we've evolved beyond that and they see something attractive in us.
Well, I think part of the answer to that question is that the they is a very broad they. I think that we have had many visitors through the ages, and I think there's been more than one intervention in our development as a species. And I think some have come here for benevolent reasons, some less benevolent. I think working as a slave species for ET colonizers, I think that is part of the human story in the deep past, but it's not the be all and end all. I think that was an episode in our story. I actually think there's pretty strong objective evidence for gold mining, for instance, in Southern Africa from around 200,000 years ago. Now, we were here at that time. Our ancestors were here, looking like us, same build as us, not quite as smart as us, apparently. Smart enough to work in someone else's mine, not smart enough to know how to farm or build a city. So I think in the deep past, that was part of our experience. If you listen to the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan story of origins, it's very frank and unflattering about our colonizers and us, really, when the colonizers sit down and say, let us make avatars for ourselves to do the heavy work and bring us our food. That's us. Only they engineered a Homo sapiens that was far more able than that. And that's part of the story. And then they have to work out how to manage this far more intelligent, more able Homo sapiens. And I think we've had others visit us in the time since who have come with a more helpful agenda, who do like us, who do have a family feeling with us. And I think this includes a lot of the stories from Sirius, from the Pleiades, who have wanted to encourage humanity to have a happy experience on planet Earth and to have a better human experience. So I think we've had a whole spectrum of relationships with a whole spectrum of visitors and colonizers, and that's why we've got such a kaleidoscopic picture of paleo contact once we listen to the ancestral narratives.
There are many in the spiritual arena who give a lot of credence to people who are channeling the Pleiadians or beings from Orion or other planets. So would you say to those people that, in fact, these are benevolent beings, perhaps from those planets, that want to assist and support us?
Well, I would probably give the advice that's in the New Testament. And this was one of the things that I'd read and shelved because I didn't quite understand it and then had to go back to it. In 1 John 4, the writer there clearly expects the early Christians to be having contact experiences with entities he calls spirits. Now, he doesn't define what these spirits are. And we shouldn't assume that this is a non-material entity that's being described, because in some cultures, spirits are physical, like you and me. A moon spirit in Papua New Guinea is a physical entity that looks like a gecko. That's very interesting that that word or that concept is even there. Physical being that looks like a gecko called a moon spirit. But what did 1 John 4 mean by spirits? Is it ancestral spirits, which are referenced elsewhere in the New Testament? Is it energy-based beings who communicate with us? Is it material beings who communicate telepathically? He doesn't say. He just expects the believers to be in contact, to be getting communication. But he says, weigh it up. Keep your sovereignty. Keep your autonomy. You don't have to believe everything you're told by whatever entity is communicating with you. Weigh it up. Does it make sense? Do you need to do something about it or not? And he also says, if any of these spirits comes and trash talks Jesus, don't take any notice of them. So this is his answer. We should fully expect contact, but we should weigh up. Is this helpful? Is this benevolent? Am I going to do something about this or not? And he says, if we're willing to do the weighing up, that's good, because the potential is there to be getting some good information.
You mentioned Jesus. I mean, what does this tell us about Jesus? Who he was?
Well, I think what I've discovered in terms of opening up the paleo-contact aspect of the Hebrew scriptures makes clearer than ever that when Jesus talks about God, he is not describing a violent, punitive, draconian entity you have to tiptoe around. He talks about the source of the cosmos, whom he addresses as Father. His follower, the Apostle Paul, described God as the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being. And you begin to see more clearly that Jesus did not equate the Elohim stories of the Hebrew scriptures or the dragon stories of the Hebrew scriptures with stories about God. He didn't use the name associated with many of the dragon stories, and that's the name Yahweh, the holy name.
Yeah.
He used the word Father, or Abba in the Aramaic. And for a lot of people, the white rabbit that leads them into the territory we're discussing is the clear moral difference between the God of Jesus and the God of the Hebrew stories. In actual fact, the name God wasn't pasted over many of these stories until the 6th century, the BCE, when these stories had existed for hundreds and maybe thousands of years. And we have a plethora of stories. We have dragon stories. We have stories of violent ET entities governing over human populations and behaving brutally and slaughtering thousands of humans in their arguments with each other. And in the 6th century BCE, those were airbrushed with the name of God to make it look like a seamless story of God. But if you start with a confidence in Jesus's teaching, you can tell something is off with those stories from the get-go. And so I still find Jesus a really helpful anchor point in working out what is going on. His own story does get reframed when you do this translation work. And I realized that there's a lot of ET aspect in the New Testament as well, and that Jesus's experience and the experience of his mum fit in a whole family of narratives that are full of ET references.
Wow. We're going to take a short break now, Paul. You're listening to What is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is researcher, speaker, and internationally best-selling author Paul Anthony Wallis. We'll be back with more from Paul after the break.
Om Times TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself. Invest in your brand and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Om Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Om Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Om Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Welcome back. Paul Wallis, why did you use the word Eden in your books?
Well, I had to think of a title that would catch people's attention, and I needed to give the hint that this was a real reframing of some old stories. When we talk about Eden, we picture paradise, don't we? We picture two beautiful, healthy, young, naked people wandering around in a paradise, living an idyllic life. And as I did the translation work in the book of Genesis, I realized Eden was not that. It was a closed zone in which a certain phase of ET visitors did their genetic work among our ancestors, fine-tuning us, developing us, putting us to work. That's in Genesis. And that this was a somewhat darker story than the word Eden would suggest. And so I thought I would reference that. Why would you want to escape from paradise? Escaping from Eden means there's a question here to be looked at. So I hoped it would intrigue people and draw people in and realize that hidden in plain sight in the Bible is this other story only a translation away from being blindingly obvious. And when people get shocked who come from a faith background and hear my conclusions, I have to say very clearly, my heart is not in any way to debunk the Bible. My agenda is to understand the Bible, to read the stories as they were written in the Bible, because if we're willing to question some long-cherished conclusions and assumptions, do some translation work, we will find this other story in the Bible that is actually very exciting and very empowering.
And it doesn't take away from people's belief, even if they don't believe in God per se, they believe in source, a great consciousness, the all that is still there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it opens up the Bible in a way that's not tribal. It's not the Bible over and against everybody else's story when you do these translation choices. And your whole picture of God and humanity opens up as you go through that process.
Yeah, and that really ought to bring religions together. It may not, but it ought to.
Well, unfortunately, religions get organized and they get feudalized. And we seem to be hardwired for feudalizing anything we create, socially speaking. And so that has happened to religion. And so religions that have started out with a very empowering, grassroots, loving one another kind of ethos become these feudalizing control mechanisms. It happened with Christianity. It happened with aspects of Judaism. It's happened with aspects of Buddhism, Islam. But that's really a human behavior that comes from our our hard wiring, our programming. But you listen to what the people at the heart of those religions said, listen to what Buddha said, listen to what Jesus said. They're actually trying to help us overcome this hard wiring that would have us always deferential and serving superiors. Jesus reframed the idea of loving God as we love one another. He reframed the idea of worshiping God as we serve one another. And Buddha, very, very similar. And if we could just get a hold of that and really run with that, it would unravel a lot of quite negative patterns in the way we organize as human beings, I think.
Well, that leads us very neatly into your new book, Echoes of Eden, which is going to be published in 2 weeks, in which you explore secrets surrounding human potential, which are hidden in the world's forbidden books. And I don't know why they were buried, but it seems to me that the potential that we had perhaps at some point been upgraded, etc., expanded consciousness, has also been dumbed down at some point, because we're in a bit of a state right now. You know, there's so much fundamentalism, there's so much anger and hate and division, and that has to be coming from some part of us that has lost touch with something very important.
I think it comes from something inside of us and something outside of us. So the something inside of us is what we might call the earliest part of our brain, the amygdala. That's our flight, fight, fright center. And so if anything sort of touches us there, that's when you get our most primitive, least finessed responses. And so when you're in an environment where you're constantly being fed fear, for instance, well, that's when you start seeing some of our more ugly behaviors. And we have been manipulated many times in that kind of a way. But then if we listen to the ancient stories, for instance, the story from southern Nigeria and Benin, the Edo story, they tell a story of Abasi and Atai as the ancient visitors who came, colonized the planet and modified our ancestors. And they create a Homo sapiens that's too conscious, too intelligent, too able, and they get very nervous. They think we're not going to be able to manage this species. And so what do they do to dumb us down, to use that phrase? They don't reprogram us. They don't change our DNA. They release devices into the environment that will make us physically ill and anxious. Because if we're a bit anxious and a bit ill, we're far more easily managed. That was their calculation. And it echoes what you find in the Mayan story, because Quetzalcoatl engineers a Homo sapiens who is us plus a really good ability in precognition, future viewing, remote viewing, telepathic connection, self-healing. And they thought, oh, we can't work with these. This can't be our working class. We can't manipulate these people if they can always anticipate us and know what we're thinking. How do we dumb them down? They have this emergency meeting, and their solution was to spray a vapor over human populations that would impede the functioning of our brains and limit us to this tiny perceptual realm we achieve through our 5 physical senses. And for anything beyond that, we have to rely on an authority to tell us what's going on. They found that was very useful. Now, these are quite dark, negative stories, but there's a positive takeaway from them, that when these particular colonizers wanted to dumb us down, they didn't reprogram us. They didn't change our DNA. They put something into the environment. And so the take home from that is that if we pay attention to toxins in our environment, if we clean up our environment, our diet, the water we drink, we can fully expect our bodies and our brains to operate better and at a higher level. And so this, I find this very interesting. There's a very quick transition from stories of human origins to stories of human potential and how to reactivate these higher cognitive abilities. And I think it's why the cultures that have curated these ancient stories of origins have also curated shamanic and mystical modalities that are all aimed at heightening our consciousness, at enabling us to be healthier and to live more intelligently on the planet. So that's the flip side of those old stories that I find very hopeful.
Well, there is probably a large fraction on the planet right now that would latch on to what you said right there, which is that if they were putting things into the atmosphere to make people anxious and make people sick, a lot of people think that's exactly what's been happening with the pandemic. I mean, people are using the word plandemic. I don't think we should go down that particular rabbit hole. I'm just pointing it out that many people will think that. What I want to concentrate on is
I'll just quickly say, planned or not, it's happened in the past, and it's happened sort of accidentally. I was old enough in the 1970s to remember journalists going after this research that was showing that leaded fuel meant that we were pumping gases into the environment that were damaging our children so that they were less intelligent and more aggressive. And those journalists got it right. That research was proven correct. And that's why we now drive cars that are hybrids or use lead-free fuel, because it turned out we were poisoning our children, and we cleaned up our environment. And I would just say, if we've been able to clean up in the past, we can clean up again, because we don't want to brain damage our children. We want to be as healthy and intelligent, as conscious as we can possibly be.
Yeah, and there's no proof that when that was happening, it was deliberate. People just didn't know. No, exactly.
They just didn't know, and it had to be proven.
Yeah. So let's talk about the potential here. I mean, the ramifications of everything that you're sharing. What effect is this likely to have on us? I mean, there's enormous potential here. There's enormous reason for hope in your books. I don't know if everybody will see that, but what do you tell people when they say, well, how is this affecting me?
I think there's some reframing I've done I found really helpful and really empowering. Before I did this translation work, I lived in a world where we people our intelligence is fixed. Our intelligence is at this level because that's where God wanted it. And the way Genesis 3 is told, it's actually wrong to try and want to be any more conscious or any more intelligent. And those who seek that through, psychic means or this, that, or the other are really doing something very wicked. It's fixed, end of story. And really the scientific answer is not so different, that we have evolved to this point. And maybe a few lucky people might have an advance on what's coming next as we slowly evolve. But essentially, this is it. This is all there is. Whereas the narratives we were just discussing say, no, we have higher cognitive abilities already in our brains, waiting to be switched on. We are all able to be more conscious than we are, and we've been practicing that for generations. So I find that very exciting, the idea that we can evolve or ascend. You do root meaning translation work with Jesus's teaching, and suddenly you realize it is an invitation to explore. So his first sermon is, the way it's translated at the moment, it sounds like a grave warning. He says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now, because of 2,000 years of imperial Christianity and translation choices, that sounds like he's saying, you better clean your life up because God's about to show up and you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him. Whereas if you do what I suggest and read the root meanings, what he's saying is go beyond the mind. That's the repent word. Go beyond the mind, because the power, principles, people of the cosmos, that's the kingdom of heaven, is waiting to be embraced. So this is an incredible invitation to explore what the power and the principles of the cosmos are. The Gospel of Thomas, which many scholars believe is the earliest collection of Jesus's teachings, begins with a saying, the kingdom of heaven is within you. So that's the powers and the principles of the cosmos are operating within you. Jesus says, waiting to be taken hold of, waiting to be embraced. So again, there's a suggestion there. We can evolve, we can ascend, we can become more intelligent and more conscious. So I think that's part of the hope that I see. But as I listen to the practice of shamanic leaders around the world, I recognize elements of what I'm seeing. When I was heavily involved in church ministry, I would experience from time to time what I called words of knowledge, which is where you suddenly get a flash of information that you can't explain how you have the information. Or you suddenly get a flash of remote viewing and you can't explain why it happened. And within the framework of Christianity, you say, well, that was like a random gift from God to help you in your ministry. But as I started touring the world, researching Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, and Echoes of Eden, I found there are people in every culture who experience these phenomena, and they may be religious or not, they may be spiritual or not. I don't think there would be a friendship circle or family circle anywhere that if you sat them down and asked, you wouldn't find a story of remote viewing or telepathic connection. So what are these? Are these aberrations? Are these just random? Or are they the firings of our higher faculties which can be developed? Now, that's not an idle question. There are neuroscientists all around the world seriously addressing that question on the basis of something called acquired savant syndrome, which is where these higher cognitive abilities get knocked on by accident. People who have a brain injury or go into a coma or a stroke come back and suddenly they can speak languages they couldn't speak before, play instruments they couldn't play before. They're brilliant at mathematics. They have these experiences of precognition. And these serious peer-reviewed neuroscientists ask the question, can we switch these things on, which are evidently latent in our brains, other than by a brain injury? And our ancestral stories say, yes, we can. And our shamanic traditions say, yes, we can. And that the switching on is not something religious or even spiritual. It's about learning to be fully human and experiencing what that can mean.
Well, certainly, all the research done, the neuroscience on meditation and what happens to the brain and the faculties that people develop after that, there is a way for people to diligently work at this.
Yes, there is. That's right. Learning to enter into certain brain states. So people might know about alpha, delta, theta. We all experience these different states, and different things happen in those different states. So, for instance, preachers like myself will often know that they can go into a zone when they're preaching, if they start preaching extempore, where they are downloading information about the people in the congregation or the situation of the church they're visiting. I've had this experience many times where I've preached that way. And afterwards, I've had a line of people saying, how on earth did you know that about us? Well, the answer is I didn't know. I just went into this particular state where I could download information from the field. I have a 7-year-old boy who routinely speaks the thoughts I'm thinking. And our kids will often respond to each other calling when they haven't yet spoken the words to call the other person. And it's really startling when a 7-year-old speaks an adult sentence that had gone through my brain half a second before. And it's because at that age, you're in a different brain state. And we're able to do those things in that state.
I'm unfortunately going to have to wrap it up here. I would love for you to come back because there's so much more to explore. There's so many things in your book that we haven't had a chance to discuss. So I hope you will agree to come back a few times more so that we can talk about each book.
I would love to. Thank you, Sandie.
Paul, thank you for being with us. I'm sorry I've got to cut it short. I hope everybody will go and read your book, Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden and Echoes of Eden, which is coming out in 2 weeks, and watch your movies, documentaries, and other things that you're doing on your website, paulanthonywallis.com. And I think they can also watch the Fifth Kind website. Is that correct?
The Fifth Kind TV on YouTube. and the
Time
Paul Wallis
TV
channel on YouTube.
and the Paul
there's the
Wallis
Paul
channel.
as well.
Yeah. And people can also check out your website. Paul Wallis, thank you. Sorry again that we've got to leave it there. Such a shame, but it's time to go. We'll be
Thanks,
back
Sandie.
again with you at the same time next week, so do stay tuned for that.